It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Keir Starmer joins other European leaders as they meet in Hungary in the wake of Donald Trump's victory. Democrats put on a brave face after a crushing defeat. What does it mean for the rest of the world? Keir Starmer offered his hearty congratulations to the president-elect in a phone call last night. But can Britain avoid this?
Tariffs, tariffs, tariff, tariff, tariffs.
The trade in goods and in services around the world is really important to us. We don't want a trade war for that reason.
We have more liquid gold, oil and gas. We have more liquid gold than any country in the world.
Donald Trump says he'll drill, baby, drill. What will be the impact on climate change? Joining us today, Labour MP Natasha Irons, the former Conservative MP who chaired Kemi Badenoch's leadership campaign, Rachel McLean, environmentalist and Guardian columnist George Monbiot, and David Goodhart from the centre-right think tank Policy Exchange. This is Politics Live. Very good afternoon. Well, there have, of course, been no shortage of verdicts on Donald Trump's election as US president and what it will mean for the rest of the world. Let us start by hearing one of those verdicts from the former Conservative Home Secretary, Suella Braverman.
The American people have spoken. He's been democratically and legitimately elected. You know, it's now the incumbent on UK politicians and the UK government to respect that decision of the American people and work with President Trump in our national interest, but and also the interests of global security, which is in a very volatile and precarious situation right now. That's why I'm emphatic that the world is a safer place now that we have Donald Trump in the White House.
The world is a safer place with Donald Trump in the White House. Natasha, would you agree?
I think it's probably too soon to say. He's not even in post yet. And I would, as I disagree with Suella Braverman on many, many things, I agree that we do have a lot of volatile situations around the world, and we need to work together with the new president as he goes forward. This is about the American people having their say, making sure that we respect that result, and ensuring that as a nation we come together. We share so many things that we need to work together on. So that might be national security, it could be our economy, our growth, and our shared values of freedom and working together. So I think it is about us as working collaboratively with President-elect Trump and going forward from there.
Rachel, is Natasha right? Is it too soon to judge, or have we seen enough already to know what Donald Trump's likely to do?
No, I think it is. I think it is too soon to judge. I mean, there's a number of huge issues. I mean, tariffs is one, and obviously, if that impacts on our trade, it'll impact our manufacturers. His stance on NATO and encouraging an increase in defence spending is something, of course, that will be good for the government.
Is it safer with Donald Trump in the White House?
Well, we just don't know at this point. He's only been elected for a couple of days. But look, he's an ally of ours and he defends freedom around the world.
George?
Well, you're all being very polite, but Braverman's statement is self-evident nonsense. I mean, Trump has a special relationship, not with us, with Vladimir Putin, and he's made it pretty clear that he's likely to cut off support to Ukraine and allow Putin to complete his invasion, in which case we're all less safe. When Trump was president before, he repeatedly threatened to use nuclear weapons. How does any of this make us safer? And to me, Braverman is one of those fake patriots who always say, yeah, I love my country, but the moment some foreign demagogue arises, they prostrate themselves in the dust. They are always the first to sell us down the river. They're always the first to stand up and say what a wonderful country this is, and then we're going to appease the people who threaten this country. I think those of us who truly love this country should say it how it is. Donald Trump is a massive threat to us.
David, George's version, Donald Trump a massive threat, or is the world a safer place, as Suella Braverman says?
That is not untypical George catastrophism. What was the Trump campaign slogan? It was peace through strength. I mean, in terms of deaths, he is likely to bring the Ukraine-Russia war to an end. Everybody knows there is going to have to be some sort of division of the country. Tens of thousands of young Russians and Ukrainians are dying every month. That is not a bad thing if that comes to it. Nearly a majority of Ukrainians now want the war to be ended. I mean, the bigger tension in the world is obviously that between the United States and China, and we're at this sort of pivotal moment, these potentially dangerous moments when one superpower is sort of threatened by the rising superpower. But in terms of China policy, there was complete continuity between Trump's policies and Biden's policies. If anything, Biden doubled down on a lot of the tariff policies, so that's not a big change. And also remember, the Abraham Accords came under Trump. Trump is the anti-war candidate in the current political situation. And this is one of the reasons why Robert Kennedy supported him, because he was the anti-war and he would not have invaded Iraq. So much of what's now happening in the Middle East is a result of the fact that Iran now dominates Iraq. So that wouldn't have happened.
George, do you want a quick response before we moved on?
Using all these euphemisms, you know, there'll be a settlement. I mean, it's effectively going to force the surrender of Ukraine to an invasion.
Well, we'll see. Mike Pompeo is likely to be his defence secretary. He's a Russia hawk, so neither of us really know what is going to happen in the next few months.
Trump's given plenty of indications.
We have a government and cross-party support within the House to stand with Ukraine. We are continuing to support Ukraine by putting £3 billion in every single year, using those Russian assets that we've seized and frozen, and using that money to leverage a loan for Ukraine to defend itself. That is a cross-party position, and that's what the government continues to do. So we will stand with the people of Ukraine, come what may.
Right, we will be coming on to what this means for Ukraine and the war there very shortly. But let us go to Budapest now, where European leaders are gathering at a meeting of the European Political Community. Remember, that's a relatively new forum established in 2022 for European nations to discuss cooperation as they digest the US election results. Security challenges, trade and Ukraine, of course, are top of the agenda. Our Europe editor, Katya Adler, is there for us. Katya, good afternoon. I mean, the host of this summit is Hungary's Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, one of President Trump's biggest fans. I mean, what is the mood there today, Katya? And are the European nations really speaking with one voice?
Well, they're not speaking to us at all, in fact. And when they are kind of wafting in front of cameras and, you know, on arrivals and making statements, leaders have been extremely careful to appear more or less to speak with one voice. You might be wondering why I'm standing in the middle of a football stadium. That is because this conference is happening right here, where those glaring lights are. The leaders are going to come for what they call their family photo, you know, when they all gather side by side. And they will attempt to have the show of unity. But when it comes to Donald Trump's return to the White House, when it comes to what should happen next in Ukraine, these countries are divided, and Donald Trump's return is increasing the strain. You're right, the host of this meeting, Viktor Orban, Hungary's Prime Minister, an outspoken Trump supporter. He says he is in the peace camp in the West and describes Donald Trump as being the same when it comes to Ukraine. People who say the war must stop now. But of course, what Trump hasn't said clearly is whether he wants Ukraine to win. And Viktor Orban also is, you know, emphasizing peace rather than how peace should come about. And he's very separate to many of the other Western European leaders here who say it's up to Ukraine when they say it's time to sit down with Vladimir Putin. So there are these stresses and strains. There's a real worry, and, you know, Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, is here as well. A worry that Donald Trump could lead to a trickle or even switch off the military aid tap. Of course, the US has been the biggest donor by far of military aid to Ukraine, so that's a big concern. But the number 2 donor of military aid, Germany, there's a big question mark over that for Ukraine as well, because of course last night Germany's governing 3-party coalition collapsed. So these really are worrying moments for Volodymyr Zelensky.
Katya, many thanks indeed. Katya Adler there, our Europe editor at the summit in Budapest. Well, I want to bring in now a guest from Washington, D.C., Fred Fleitz. He served as Chief of Staff on the National Security Council in Donald Trump's first administration, and he is now at the America First Policy Institute think tank. Fred, very good afternoon to you, and thank you for joining us here on Politics Live. I mean, you heard Katya there talking about what was on the agenda for this meeting today. Ukraine, obviously at the top off the agenda. President Trump has repeatedly said he could end this war in a day. Will he do this now?
It's a pleasure to be here. I think there's a lot of confusion over President Trump's approach to the war in Ukraine. And I might add, I'm not speaking for him because he speaks for himself. But Trump is determined to end the war because he thinks this has become an endless war of attrition. This doesn't mean giving in to Putin or appeasing Putin. It's recognizing the situation on the ground. And Trump has said he'd like to have a peace agreement that's fair to both sides. And in my opinion, I would urge him to take this approach. There's no strategy right now by Europe or by the United States. We have a position to arm Ukraine for as long as it takes because we hate Putin, because he's been demonized as being a war criminal, likening him to Hamas, which is what Joe Biden did. This is frankly virtue signaling. There's no strategy here. Basically, it seems that Western leaders are prepared to fight the Ukrainian war for their principles to the last Ukrainian soldier. Ukraine's running out of soldiers. So I think the best way to end the war is to have a leader determined to do so. Trump is determined to end it. He said this to both sides, and I think that effort's going to start now.
Right. Well, President Zelensky is also out in Budapest. Should he be worried, Fred? I just want to read you a tweet that he put out after speaking to Donald Trump. He said, "We agreed to maintain close dialogue and advance our cooperation. Strong and unwavering US leadership is vital for the world and for a just peace." Should President Zelensky be worried about Donald Trump's re-election?
Well, I hope not, because Trump has said he wants a solution to this conflict that is fair. Now, what I would urge for Mr. Trump is to take an approach, and I wrote this up in a paper that was published in the spring, that the conflict is frozen along the current battle lines and negotiations begin. And Ukraine doesn't give up anything until there's a negotiated settlement, with the understanding that it may not get its territory back until Putin leaves the political scene. But the current way that this conflict is developing into a war of attrition that is killing off a whole generation of young Ukrainian men. That's immoral, and that has to change.
Fred, just stay with us if you don't mind. I just want to bring in some of our guests in the studio. I mean, David, you mentioned when we got into this earlier that that President Trump was likely to result in fewer deaths. Are you reassured by what you've heard from Fred?
Yeah, I am actually, and I think he is going to bring pressure on both sides to come to some kind of settlement that is acceptable to both sides. What that means in terms of security guarantees for Ukraine is the big unanswered question. It'll presumably be a frozen conflict like Korea was. But don't forget that the Biden regime has not been allowing Ukraine to use a lot of the key weapons on Russian soil. So, Ukraine, you could say, has always been fighting with one hand tied behind its back. I mean, Trump is the sort of guy who, if the Russians don't play and don't negotiate, he will release the possibility of the Ukrainians using weapons on Russian territory.
George, if President Trump proposes, as Fred says, a settlement that works for both sides, would that be something that President Zelensky should accept?
Yeah, well, it's not going to work for both sides, is it? I mean, it's a bit like saying, right, France has invaded the UK. France can have Kent and Sussex, and then we'll just call that quits, shall we? I mean, this is an imperial invasion. It's a war of aggression against a sovereign nation. And what I'm hearing here are the voices of appeasement.
Fred, would you like to respond to that? George has called, he says he's hearing the voices of appeasement.
In 2022, I think there was a good prospect of pushing most Russian troops out if Ukraine got the weapons it had requested. But the West didn't give those weapons to Ukraine. And I understand that it certainly is an outcome that nobody's happy about, that Russia may not be giving back the territory it has seized immediately. But I don't see a way to get Russia out of Ukraine. If the guest who just said that has a solution, I'd like to hear it. I have a solution on how we can get Russian troops out of Ukraine. We can send in NATO troops. The U.S. doesn't want to do that. The U.K. doesn't want to do that. So unless we're going to do that, because Russia is so well dug in Ukraine, another approach has to be found. And there's growing support on the right and left in the United States to find another approach, that this long-term policy of arming Ukraine for as long as it takes is not working, is immoral, and we have to find another way.
There is one group of people who should decide what happens in Ukraine, and that's the Ukrainians.
But that's true,
Rachel.
George. But on the other hand, it is also British taxpayers who are also spending money to defend Ukrainians and also welcoming and to defend ourselves and also welcoming Ukrainians in. Now, obviously, I'm a strong supporter of that. It was something I was proud of that we did in the last Conservative government. But there does need to be a plan going forward. So I think the government now, the Labour government now, does need to come forward with a plan about what is going to be our response from the UK as well to the Ukraine conflict.
This sounds a bit like an evolution, Rachel, of the Tory position. Is this something that Kemi Badenoch believes?
Yeah. No, there's no evolution here. What I've just said is I'm very proud of what we did for Ukraine. We stood by Ukraine, and we helped.
That sounds like the past tense.
Because I'm talking about the Conservative government.
But as the UK, should the UK continue to stand by Ukraine?
We lost an election, so we now have a Labour government.
Which is standing by Ukraine.
And I'm proud of what happened. So it is now for the Labour government to come forward with a new plan in the new world order where President Trump is the president and there's a foreign secretary who doesn't, who's got a strong issue with President Trump. So they need to figure out how they're going to build that relationship with President
Natasha,
Trump.
does there need to be a new plan when it comes to Ukraine?
I think we need to continue the cross-party support for the members of the Conservative Party that remain in Parliament who have stood by our plan to continue to support the Ukrainian people in defending themselves and to stand by their side. We are continuing to invest in that support, and we're continuing to do things like as I said earlier, using the money we're getting from the sanctions that we've put on Russian assets and using that money to help Ukraine in the future. That's the only real plan here. And, talking about the Foreign Secretary's relationship, I'm pretty sure David Cameron had a few things to say about President-elect Trump, and also his Vice President had a few things to say about him, but people move on. And I think it's time that we think about the future and think about these future relationships. We need to work with President-elect Trump to make sure that we keep Ukraine safe and sovereign.
Fred, I just want to bring you back in here because you had mentioned NATO a little bit earlier on. President Trump has obviously been clear about his scepticism of NATO and European freeloading as he sees it. How do you think this is going to manifest this sentiment this time round?
I want to first briefly respond to the last host. The money's not being spent by the UK to help Ukraine defend itself. This money is being spent to maintain a stalemate, to maintain a war of attrition that Ukraine will eventually lose. And I know it sounds noble. We're standing up to dictatorship. We're defending a democracy. But long term, this is not a sustainable strategy. That's why another approach has to be taken. Concerning NATO, Trump is obviously going to be very tough on NATO to make sure that NATO members pay their fair share to defend the region. I think Trump is going to be even harder on a number of states, not the UK, but on a number of European states to pay their fair share to defend Ukraine. And I'm talking about Germany, especially France and Italy. The U.S. gets criticized for its policy in Ukraine and the debate in Washington on whether to continue to arm it. But states like Germany are not getting the attention they should be getting for not defending Ukraine, for not sending the weapons in that Ukraine needs. So I think the debate is going to be very different under President Trump.
Natasha, I do want to come back to you on that point. I mean, is money being spent to just preserve a stalemate in Ukraine?
I reject that. I don't think that's true, and I think that
But it's not sustainable, according to Fred, in the long term, as a long-term strategy.
Of course, we need a long-term plan for how we end this, but I don't think that is about not protecting the sovereignty of the Ukrainian people. Ukraine is, we've been very clear about helping Ukraine get into NATO and be on that pathway into becoming a NATO state. And I think that's the future of Ukraine. This isn't just about Ukraine, is it? It's about the future of Europe, and it's about the future of our shared values and what we do together. So it's in all of our interests to protect the sovereignty of Ukraine.
Yeah. George, briefly, can I just ask you, I mean, is this the time, discussion about NATO, is this the time for Europe to start considering strengthening its own defence cooperation?
I think it will have to, especially if Putin is allowed to win on any terms, some terms in Ukraine. Poland is then at risk. The Baltic states are then at risk. All the way along that border, there is risk. And we can't rely on Trump anymore. I think, we do need stronger ties within Europe. I would love to see the UK rejoining the single market, rejoining the customs union, in order to strengthen those ties. Unfortunately, Starmer ruled that out, but we have seen certain U-turns happen within this Labour government, so there is hope.
Russia simply doesn't have the capacity to threaten Europe in the way that George is describing. I mean, I think that is that is a fantasy. And we should actually be also listening to what the people of Ukraine are saying. And increasingly the people of Ukraine are saying we've had enough of this sort of, First World War sort of stalemate.
I think you're speaking on behalf of people who would not consider you are accurately representing them there.
Well, have you looked at the polls recently? I mean, nearly 50% of people now want a negotiated settlement in Ukraine. That number is increasing pretty dramatically.
OK, I just want to turn to another pressing issue concerning Europe as a result of Donald Trump's re-election. Let us have a listen to someone who is offering himself up as a bridge, in his own words, between Donald Trump and Keir Starmer, the Reform leader, Nigel Farage.
I come back to the point of trade. This matters because I think where the Prime Minister will find himself is stuck between Brussels, with whom he wants a closer relationship, and America, with whom not having a big tariff regime is vital to our economy. So it's going to be make your mind up time for the British Prime Minister. Do we go into direct negotiations with America as soon as the Trade Secretary is appointed, or do we stick to the Brussels line?
Right, the issue of tariffs there being pointed out by Nigel Farage. Donald Trump says tariff is his favourite word. He's proposing at least a 10% blanket tariff on all imports into the US, with tariffs as high as 60% on goods from China. Rachel, is Nigel Farage right? Is it decision time for the UK?
He's right in that respect. I mean, look, tariffs are going to be damaging for UK business, for UK manufacturers. They're already being hit by higher taxes from this Labour government. So
is it time to choose? Is it time to choose now?
Yes, I mean, what we're hearing from the Labour Party now and Keir Starmer is that he wants a closer cooperation with Europe. Well, this is a deal scenario. If the Labour Party don't like the deal that was negotiated, that's fine. That's up to them. They've been elected now. But when you are doing a deal, you are trading something for something else. You don't just get something for nothing. So if they want closer collaboration, they'll have to give something else up. So that's what we haven't heard from Labour.
Right, and the choice, Natasha, according to Nigel Farage, is closer cooperation with the EU at the expense, potentially, of a deal with the US.
I sort of reject that. Why is it either or? Why can we not have a good relationship with America and a good relationship with the EU? If we want to genuinely solve, for example, the small boats crisis, we cannot
but it's all
do
about.
that.
But isn't it about picking a side in a potential trade war, which Donald Trump is threatening?
Again, I don't know why we're coming back to these sorts of aggressive tactics. What this is about is having closer relationships with all of the partners that can benefit us economically and our security. But it's also important for America because they don't want to increase the price of goods going into their country any more than we would want in ours. So we have to work together on that. But also, if we do want to secure our borders, we have to work with Europe. So pretending as if we can sort of turn our back on Europe to do that is wrong. So having the Prime Minister speaking with European leaders today to discuss how we improve things like data sharing, and I know that sounds completely unsexy, but, at the moment, if you were arrested and jailed in Italy for people smuggling, you could turn up without anybody knowing anything about it because we got rid of that when we... let's stick to the issue of tariffs. Fred Flights, I do want to bring you back in here. We've heard quite strong words from President Trump. He obviously has form. He's imposed tariffs before. What should we make of his intentions? Is he going to do it?
Well, President Trump proposes tariffs to counter unfair trade practices. If a nation's not engaging in unfair trade, they don't have to worry about tariffs. The president believes that U.S. trade with the European Union has been extremely unfair with efforts to protect a variety of European businesses and industries against the United States, especially the auto industry. So that will be where these tariffs come from. And I think that America has a better relationship with the UK, and I hope there is a special relationship in trade that develops much further during a Trump presidency.
Would a closer relationship, Fred, with the EU put that at risk?
I don't have an opinion on that. I will say that I think most of the problems with Europe in Trump's mind, again, I don't want to speak for him, comes from the European Union and its unfair trade practices towards the United States.
Right, David.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true. I mean, the EU countries are obviously much more in the Trump firing line than we are. But partly because of defence spending, we actually do spend the NATO 2% and are pledged to spend 2.5. I hope the current government will continue what the Tories had promised on that. They're also much more on the firing because their surpluses, most of their surpluses are bigger than ours. We also have a trade surplus with the US, but it's not quite as big. I mean, Trump is a sort of Britophile. His mother was Scottish, or was Scottish. But
so
actually,
do you think that Britain can play a special role then in sort of mediating?
I mean, I don't think the key figure here is not Nigel Farage. The key figure is Elon Musk. I mean, Elon Musk has factories, Tesla factories in China. I think the issue is not so much tariffs. There will be some change to the tariff regime and they will go up probably a little bit. But the key thing is subsidies. Green tech subsidies that were introduced by the Biden regime have sucked lots of industry has left Europe.
Right, we're going to come on to
America.
David.
When it's subsidies, not tariffs, is the thing to watch.
OK, George.
Well, here we are discussing the classic British delusion. You know, we really count in America, you know, and what Donald Trump is, he's got to decide whether he's siding with the UK or not. He probably couldn't even place us on a map. He couldn't give a damn about the UK.
His mother is Scottish.
Yeah,
I mean...
but, you know, he's not interested. Donald Trump is interested in Donald Trump. He does not have preferences. He has interests. The US has always had interests. The UK has always had interests. But we have this myth of the special relationship, and we really count in the minds of American presidents. Sorry, we don't.
Fred, is the special relationship a myth?
Well, look, I flew to Scotland with the president on Air Force One, so I think he knows where the UK is. and I do believe that the president there's a special place in his heart for the United Kingdom. And I think we're going to see that in this. And even though there's a Labour government, I think there's going to be a wonderful relationship. I think your prime minister did the right thing in meeting with Mr. Trump before the election. And I think they're going to hit it off well. And there's going to be a closer relationship, I think, between the US and the UK than there will be with a number of European nations because of trade and because of this problem with NATO spending.
OK, well, Fred...
We hit them every 4 years.
George?
Well, it's always the same story. You know, yes, there's going to be this special relationship. No, sorry. If there's any special relationship, it's with Trump and Putin. OK, well, talking of the relationship, let us just have a look at this comment from 2017 by the now Foreign Secretary David Lammy. Yes, he says, if Trump comes to the UK, I will be out protesting on the streets. He is a racist, KKK and Nazi sympathiser. Fred, is this going to jeopardise the relationship? Well,
David Lammy went out of his way to meet with Trump advisors over the summer, and I understand he met with Senator Vance. I think that's promising. I will say that I declined to meet with Lammy because of those comments myself, but I'm willing to give Lammy a second chance, and I think President Trump will too.
So he doesn't need to apologise?
But President Trump...
I think he should apologise.
Trump famously bears grudges. I mean, I would be surprised if David Lammy is still Foreign Secretary in a year's time.
If President Trump bared grudges, then Vance would not be his vice president, would he? Because he has said some quite spicy things himself in the past, has he not?
Yeah, but he's valuable to him in a way that David Lammy is not valuable.
If that's your take, but I think that, as I said earlier on, you will be hard pressed to find a politician from any Western government that hasn't said something in the past about.
We've just heard from Fred, Natasha, that he should apologise, suggesting that David Lammy should apologise. This is coming from someone who knows President Trump pretty well.
Well, that's up to David Lammy and the conversations that he's had with him in private. But I think that what you've seen is both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary go out of their way to speak to President Trump in private and have those conversations and build those relationships. You've got a Prime Minister now who is very keen to build relationships across the world. And we've got a Foreign Secretary that's doing the same. And
David Lammy should absolutely not apologise because what he said is actually true.
Right, well, there's clearly
if it was true, why would he appoint a vice president who's married to an Asian woman?
A vice president who himself has called Trump America's Hitler.
And Vance was useful.
He's clearly racist. He is clearly a sympathiser with far-right and fascist movements. That is true. It's demonstrable fact.
Right, Fred, just before we let you go, I do have to ask you, President Trump is obviously putting his administration together. Are you waiting by the phone?
Well, I'll happily serve for President Trump if he asks me to. And I guess when people talk about Trump being a racist and all these other things, I'll note that this was a really comprehensive and decisive election where he significantly increased his support from African Americans and from women. And it's just an unfair thing to say
that doesn't stop him from being a racist.
Doesn't have support from a very broad coalition in our country.
Both things can be true?
Both things can be true.
George?
Well, it's true. I mean, he's made plenty of racist comments, plenty of really outrageous, obnoxious comments. Sure, people voted for him, but that doesn't stop Trump from being a racist.
Rachel?
Well, it's up to the American citizens to elect President Trump, and he's won a massive landslide.
Right. Fred, many thanks indeed to you for joining us. Fred Flights there. I do want to turn now to one of the other big questions surrounding Donald Trump's re-election in terms of its global impact, what it means for climate action. Let us just have a listen to Donald Trump talking about his love of oil.
Leave the oil to me. We have more liquid gold, oil and gas. We have more liquid gold than any country in the world, more than Saudi Arabia. We have more than Russia.
George, how much of a setback is President Trump's election to the cause of climate change, tackling climate change?
He'll definitely leave the Paris Agreement, which is the framework under which all the negotiations, all the aims of trying to curb climate breakdown take place. He will probably leave the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change as well, which is the overarching treaty.
And if he leaves Paris, George, this time, it would be more damaging than the last time he did it.
Yeah, much more. Well, especially if he leaves the Framework Convention, because that's much, much harder to reverse. I mean, and we know he's going to unleash the fossil fuel industry. He said so himself. And we're already at an incredibly dangerous point. We don't know where the tipping points are. We know that Earth systems are complex systems. All complex systems have tipping points. If you push them too far, they go past that point, and that is a point of no return. Whatever that system might be. It might be the collapse of the Atlantic circulation system. It might be the collapse of the ice sheets, the collapse of the Amazon basin, and these things are irreversible. And so, even if this is just 4 years, and Trump or Trumpism doesn't continue beyond that point, and that's a very big if, that damage might be forever, and we might be pushed past these absolutely crucial tipping points. I mean, the truth is, Trump did not invent our climate disaster. We were losing slowly already. We were losing slowly under Biden. We are losing slowly under Keir Starmer. Now we are losing fast.
David, we're losing fast.
Let's just actually look at some facts. Where are carbon emissions coming from in the world? So America has the highest per capita carbon emissions of any country, but it is way, way, way behind China on absolute emissions. China has something like 3 times more emissions and growing. India is catching up with America. India is in 3rd place in absolute emissions. And the other key fact is that America's emissions are falling quite fast. I think they've fallen by 11% since 2010. That's mainly because they've shifted from coal to gas. America is an incredibly innovative country. They're investing hugely in green technology. They've recently had huge subsidies in green technology, and that will undoubtedly continue. These are the things that matter, not whether... Trump may well pull America out of the Accords. The Accords will still go on without America. What matters is American emissions are falling and Chinese emissions are rising. And we need to take the green tech to be more self-sufficient in green technology than we are at the moment. China completely dominates these supply chains.
Well, I'm not going to take any lessons in climate from someone from Policy Exchange, which is funded by the oil industry. The important thing...
by the oil industry.
I can demonstrate that it is, but if you want to show who all your funders are, we would be delighted to see them, David, because we only discover who your funders are by accident.
I'd be very happy to
But we know that some of them are oil companies. But without a global framework, without an agreement, what we have is a perfect circle of finger-pointing. Everyone says, well, you've got to take action. It's your fault. It's the Chinese. No, it's you, the Americans. You've got much bigger historical emissions. Everyone can blame everyone else. You have to have a global agreement in place. Trump is ripping that agreement up. How can we move forward without one?
Natasha, how much of a threat is Trump to global climate action?
Again, I think the interesting thing, during this election race, the environment wasn't something that was discussed much during the election. So again, I'm not sure really what President Trump's current plans are for America's emissions and for their green transition. All I can really talk about is I think what I agree with George is that every nation is responsible for its own footprint and for its own journey. And I think when we look at what we've done with GB Energy and the things in the UK, it's not just about cutting emissions. It's actually a practical thing to develop good jobs in this country and to reindustrialise part of this country that's been completely neglected for over a decade. So moving ourselves off of global energy markets and standing on our own 2 feet and owning our own energy, clean energy, is not just about climate change. It's a practical solution to a lot of the industrial issues that we have in this country as well.
Rachel, quick final word on this.
Oh, well, I don't think GB Energy is any type of practical solution. It isn't anything. It's just a name and a slogan. I don't think it delivers anything at all.
And you delivered what over 14 years?
We did get emissions down, and
energy bills going all over the place.
And we did. Well, you've just put energy bills up on pensioners.
And most deindustrialisation took place under New Labour.
Yeah,
I mean, this has been happening
yes,
whichever party is in power.
I think
and actually, the Trump mask economics
nothing.
is about reindustrialising. And the odd thing about Trump Musk economics is that it's, on the one hand, kind of libertarian and sort of free market, but on the other hand, very, very industrial policy.
I would agree with that. I will agree with that. But the point is that the future of this is green technology. So to reindustrialise a place isn't just going to be in old technologies.
Yeah.
And if you're talking about Elon Musk and you're talking about the future,
yeah.
this is where the future is. We are now part of that. So to sit there and say, oh well, let's do nothing.
If I can just finish,
Rachel,
I was
very briefly because we do have to move on.
GB Energy is just this big state thing. What you need is to unleash private enterprise.
That's
the
worked
market
really well.
will solve this.
It's worked really well.
Right. Well, we could carry on talking about this all afternoon, but I do want to turn to one of the pressing challenges back here in the UK, the issue of care, childcare, caring for the elderly. And David Goodhart here has written a new book. It's called The Care Dilemma, Caring Enough in the Age of Sex Equality. David, can you set out for us what the dilemma is?
Well, it's basically the dilemma between freedom for men and perhaps particularly for women over recent decades and the continuing demands for care for the dependent, young and old. And I think what we've done, we've sort of overshot, and we've come to devalue what happens in the family, in the domestic realm. I mean, in the UK, we have the most miserly family policy. I mean, parental support, you get, for maternity pay, you get 90% for 6 weeks, and then you're on a pittance of 150 quid. We don't recognise the family in the tax system. We're out of step, even with other rich countries. And I think the undervaluing of the domestic realm and the family has led to all sorts of unhappy outcomes in huge family instability. Kids in the UK do not live, nearly half of kids in the UK do not live with both of their biological parents by the age of 14. Again, we're an outlier in Europe on this, and yet we have a kind of taboo about talking. We don't talk about family structure. It's considered a taboo. We have ever-expanding social spending, partly because the family has become so much more unstable and dispersed and weaker. We have a huge falls in fertility, and we have, like other rich countries, recruitment crises in care jobs because we don't value those attributes. Now, the reason it's a dilemma is because a lot of these things are the consequences of good things. The fact that women are much freer to pursue jobs and careers, much less defined by motherhood and family. And those are good things. So the challenge is, there is no constituency for going back to the 1950s.
Right.
So how do we invest enough of those things and keep the freedoms?
Right, so you're saying that women entering the workplace has led to family instability.
One of the factors, yeah.
Led to children's declining mental health, led to ballooning spending on social services. Is that right?
Family instability. I mean, I'm not blaming women for this. I'm just saying the choices.
You're describing it as an unintended consequence. Natasha, is he right?
I'm glad you're not blaming women for the downfall of the family environment, because that would be very bad.
Look,
I think there is some very key things. I'm a parent myself. I have a 3-year-old and a 9-year-old, and whenever I hear about things like declining birth rate and I hear about family and I hear about this, I do think as a nation we're not a very family-centred country. And we don't make it easy for people to go on maternity leave. We have a leader of opposition who's decided that maternity leave is too excessive.
That's absolutely
That is not rubbish.
nonsense.
It's a direct quote.
She did say that.
No, you're putting
all right,
words
fine.
in her mouth.
Okay, sure. You can look it up. You can watch it. Maybe if you were there, you could see. So she has said that. That is a concern to me. But I think crucially, some of the things that we see in terms of the decline of the family actually just comes down to basic things such as housing and such as the cost of childcare and things like that. So if you are not being able to set down roots until you're in your late 30s, early 40s, already then you're kind of delaying starting your family. And then if you do start a family, trying to get childcare is quite expensive. So up until very recently, it cost me £1,700 a month to put my toddler into nursery. That's an entire salary. And if you step back from your career, you then go back in at a lower level. So I think there are a number of things that we should be looking at to make ourselves a more child and family-centred nation. But I would very much hope that that isn't put on the shoulders of women and the decisions that women have taken to go into the workplace. Because also, it is I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a family now where you didn't need two people going out to work. You need two incomes.
And we should make it easier for one parent, increasingly the father, to stay at home when children are young. We don't. We spend £9 billion a year now on childcare, and obviously we need good childcare so people can combine parenthood and work. But why not give the money direct to families, and then they can choose whether to spend it on nursery care or granny or on themselves? I mean, just refunneling the existing money, you could have a home carer's allowance of nearly £10,000 a year. That would make families would be so much less stretched. And that stretch often leads to relationships breaking, particularly when you have young children.
Okay. Rachel, I mean, I have to ask you, because it was under the Conservatives that the childcare policy was massively expanded. David mentioned the increased spending on that, but part of that was about encouraging women to go to work. I mean, was that the right choice? Was that the right message to women? Get out there back in the workplace, even if you don't necessarily want to?
No, I actually don't think it was. I personally struggle with that a little bit. I think we should talk more about families and encouraging responsibility of families. I'd love to read David's book. I think it's a live debate. I'm very interested in this policy. And I think, look, I've got 4 children as well, and I've got 2 grandchildren now. So, this is not an abstract thing for me and my family. And combining work with children is very hard, but it's about the right way of doing it. I don't think the state can do all of it. And I think we should empower women and parents and fathers as well to do more as much as they possibly can.
George, empowering fathers?
Well, yeah, I mean, we should all be the best parents we possibly can. But one thing I'll ask David is, have you done an analysis of the impact of inequality? Because there's some very strong data showing that families do better, children do better, there's less mental health issues in a more equal society. And one of the things that has changed is that we're becoming more unequal again.
Well, there are 2 kinds of equalities we're talking about here. I mean, there's kind of male-female inequality, and then there's sort of income inequality. I mean, what we have at the moment is much more intact families in the top sort of third or half of the income spectrum, and it's families in the bottom half of the income spectrum that are so much more
classic impact of inequality.
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, it's a factor. It's not necessarily the factor. I mean,
have you done?
Poorer, There's lots of stuff in the book on all that, and poorer. People who come from poorer but more stable families do a lot better than kids that come from richer but unstable families. So it is a factor.
What can make a family unstable is that you're bouncing around from temporary accommodation place to temporary accommodation place. You can't put roots down and build a community around you to help you with your childcare. Or you are relocated miles away from your local authority because they can't house you. So I think dealing with things like the structural issues that we have, basic things like dealing with the housing crisis in this country, will have a massive impact on the stability of families. I mean, some of the data you can get back in terms of children's well-being, if you ask them what their biggest concerns are, it's feeling safe, but it is also the cost of living crisis, because they pick up the stresses and strains of that from their parents.
It is a factor. And of course, men have got to step up. And men are actually stepping up more than is often acknowledged, at least in the domestic sphere, sharing childcare responsibilities. It's gone from like 70-30 to sort of more like 60-40. What they're not good at.
I totally agree about men stepping up. I do worry there's a kind of individuation of blame. We've been hit and hit and hit by austerity, and that's had a devastating impact on family life.
Natasha, what is the right policy response to this?
Well, I would agree that austerity has had an impact on family life. I do, because I think, well, look, I was a local councillor. The casework I pick up from families are people desperate to put down roots so they can raise their children in a stable place. I do agree that and that they can be connected to the schools, for example.
But the big increases in family breakdown actually happened in the 1990s when the economy was going gangbusters. I mean, these things are cultural things and economic things don't always run in complete parallel.
No, but what we're talking about today, the current decline, the speed in which birth rates, for example, are declining, that has been linked to how people feel and how secure they feel. You are not going to bring more children into the world if you don't feel secure yourself. So I think the policies we have around housing, the things we have around raising the minimum wage, and making sure that we've got, so the policy around extending childcare is fine now that we have the capacity to actually do it, because we're taking the empty primary schools and turning it into...
Natasha, many thanks indeed. I'm afraid we are almost out of time. That is it from us today. Joe will be back on Monday with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and on iPlayer.